Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Way of the Gun, A Bloody Journey into the World of Firearms, by Iain Overton, narrated by Matthew Waterson. Preface. A few years ago, I created an email alert from Google News. It was a simple, three-letter word, gun. And in the weeks and months that followed, each and every morning, an email would ping through. Each offered up a dozen news stories from the previous day, all on the matter of guns. And yet, despite the email being one that should cover stories about guns around the world, each day there was one constant. All the stories were about the United States. This Google Alert's focus on guns in America was, to some degree, disconcerting to me. As a journalist and filmmaker, I had traveled to dozens of countries around the world where guns and the violence they bring were a daily occurrence. From Central and South America to Africa and the Middle East. I've seen countless places where the gun wreaks havoc and claims untold lives. These are often places riven with corruption, lands ruled by despots, countries marked by a failed rule of law and the ugly stamp of poverty. These are places where lives seem, all too often, to be as cheap as a bullet. My Google News feed should have picked up on these dark realities. But it is gun violence in the United States, and that country alone, that dominates. This is partly because the world's media dances to a tune all too often orchestrated by that global superpower. But it is also because the US has, quite simply, the most unique relationship with guns of any other country I know. For a start, it is by far the most dangerous place for gun violence in the world of developed economies. There are over 3 times as many Americans killed by guns per capita than in any other wealthy country, and over 10 times the rate in comparable countries such as Japan, France, and Britain. That is not all. It is, globally, the country with the most gun suicides. It is a land with the highest rate of gun ownership, a nation with the highest number of gun imports and exports per year. It's a land where, since the terrible shootings of Sandy Hook in December 2012, bills have been introduced that would legalize the carrying of concealed weapons in bars, allow teachers to carry guns in schools, and even make businesses liable for customers' injuries or deaths if they did not permit their clients to enter the shop carrying a loaded weapon. The only country in the world where laws governing the carrying of firearms have been relaxed, not tightened, after a gun massacre. The US, quite simply, is the land of the gun. It's the gunfight at the OK Corral. It's Harry Callahan's "Go ahead, make my day." It's the sniper bullet that killed JFK. It's Colt and Smith & Wesson, Custer's Last Stand, and Annie Get Your Gun, Quentin Tarantino, drive-by shootings and SWAT teams. It's the deaths of John Lennon and Martin Luther King, and the oiled-up swagger of Stallone and Schwarzenegger. It's Sandy Hook, Columbine, Virginia Tech, Fort Hood, Aurora, and school shootings in Oregon. And it's endless figures about guns and violence that are so disturbing they just blunt you. But perhaps it is best to start with those hard facts. Just take 1 decade of gun statistics in the US. Between 2004 and 2013, according to data from the US Bureau of Justice, over 4.5 million people were the victims of gun crime in the United States. Of these, the FBI reports almost 95,000 firearm homicides. It's a figure that is over 5 times the number of knife murders. The FBI data also shows that, between 2004 and 2013, 66 children under the age of 1 were shot and killed in the US. A further 363 children between the ages of 1 and 4 died from a gunshot wound. In total, in that decade, 4,207 American children 16 or younger were killed by guns. This is not all. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, their upper figures show that just under 1 million Americans may have been shot but survived, though this figure should be taken with a pinch of salt. The truth is that no one knows how many people are shot and injured every year in the US. If you are American, then I am sure you know of someone who has been shot. If you're European, the chances are you don't. There are other figures too, the terrible and personal moments of gun horror. In that decade, over 185,000 Americans shot and killed themselves, deaths that never made the global news. Such violent death and injury has been fueled, without question, by America's love for the gun. In that decade, the US imported over $10 billion of arms and ammunition and exported about $5 billion worth. And the Department of Defense spent nearly $11.5 billion on guns and ammunition. What does this add up to? Well, it leads to one thing at least. You can't even begin to write a book about guns without writing a book about the US. And it means that any book that charts a global journey into the communities that proliferate around the gun has to acknowledge that the world's greatest superpower has embedded within its constitution the right to bear arms. So it was that, writing this book, I was to meet many American gun owners, and many of them, even with the best intentions, would cock their heads to the side and say in as polite a way as they could, "You see, our approach to guns is different from Europe's." It seemed to many of them that I lost my right to write about guns simply because I was not an American. But to me it was better that I was not an American writing this book. My view could remain as much as possible uncontaminated by the fervor and prejudices that exist, on both political sides, of the US gun debate. Perhaps more important, it also enabled me to get the wider view. As a journalist and a filmmaker, a weapons researcher and a former gun club president, a hunter and a sports shooter, it enabled me to put America's love for guns in a global context, to see what impact the Second Amendment had on international smuggling networks, arms trade deals, UN gun conventions, and perhaps most important for me, it gave me the chance to find a wider meaning in the countless Americans who have died at the end of the gun. In essence, this is what this book is about. It is an attempt to understand the world of the gun without getting caught up in the endless debate in America about the right to bear arms. It is a journey navigated through facts and realities, not politics and prejudice. A passage undertaken open-minded, and yet simultaneously deeply disturbed by what I had seen. It is, quite simply, the way of the gun. 1. Introduction. 1. The gun. Brazil. A murder in Sao Paulo. A child's sorrow and a dead mother. The descent into a police arms cache. A revelation. A journey conceived. Leeds, UK. A secret museum and a meeting with an expert. To a Swiss canton to visit an oracle. It began with a death. The 5-year-old had lain alone with his lifeless mother all night long, curled up at her cold feet. It was only when the thin light of dawn lifted some of the darkness from the bedroom that the neighbors had heard the boy's cries. And only then did people realize what had happened in those sunless hours before. The bullet had entered the left side of the young woman's temple and exited at the back of her head, splattering flecks on the leprous wall. There had often been wild-voiced arguments in that cramped house, but no one ever thought it would come to this. After the boy was found, the police arrived quickly. But the murderous lover had already fled that Brazilian city and, like the gun he had used, he was nowhere to be found. By the time we reached the quiet roadside home, the child had also been spirited away, covered in a blanket, lifted from his dark pietà, and carried out into the light. His mother was still inside. Cars passed, leaving Sao Paulo for the north, and we stood awkwardly and watched them go. They slowed down and watched us too, a huddle of cops and a documentary crew crowded beside a white ambulance that was never really needed. A dog barked in the distance, and I took up my video camera and walked inside. The dead woman had run a small shop out the front, and it was filled with packets of colored sweets and warm bottles of luminescent drinks. On the counter was a tray of Catholic pendants, which she had sold to the weary lorry drivers who would stop here. But these plastic icons had not helped her last night, and now she lay beyond, past a dusty glass counter, down a narrow corridor, there in a pool of silence. They say death smells sweet. That's what I thought as I walked into her bedroom. A taste touched my mouth and reminded me of the orange-tinted bottles that lined the shop's walls, or the citrus chocolate puffs that lay neatly arranged in their shiny little packages. The air was thick with this smell. It had been over 12 hours since she had died, and this was the start of summer. Her name was Lucy Clegg, and she was naked. I was not expecting that, but death rarely grants us dignity, so her breasts hung to the side, and the rest was uncovered. There was not much blood, save for a smear above her pinched, sallow face. Finding a corner, I set up my tripod and got to work. The police did not tell me to stop filming, but by now I was not even sure why I was doing this. My footage would never end up on the evening bulletins. The film I was making with Ramita Navai, an Anglo-Iranian journalist who was used to witnessing such things, was about the toll of violence in one of Brazil's deadliest cities. But Britain's Channel 4 News could never show such intimate and murderous detail. I felt I had to do something, though. So I focused on her unfurled hands and on the trinkets that lined the top of her chipped cabinet, and shifted the lens onto the face of a purple bear I imagined her lover had once bought her. And the whir of the tape and the camera took the edge off the awkward quiet of the room. I carried on filming until the forensic examiners wrapped her in a heavy blanket, and all I could think of as she was lifted heavily up, covered like her son had been, was how hot it was to have such a blanket to sleep under. We followed the body out into the light and slipped back into our car. Then, after waiting for the coroner's van to slide away, we two pulled out and drove south, following an unhurried squad car back to the city's police headquarters, and none of us spoke. The building was low-slung and squat, built in the way Brazilian architects love: concrete, slats, and shutters, municipal chic that was made markedly less chic and more threatening by the armed police standing behind its long glass front. The steps leading up to it were broad and shallow. They twisted in an arc and made the walk to the doors of justice a slow one. An image of Sao Paulo as a dystopian city, something out of a Judge Dredd comic, came to mind. This was its rigid heart of order and legal retribution, but policemen stood, their arms cradling dull metallic weapons. The reason for this was clear. In 1 year alone there were over 1,000 gun murders in this city, in waves of crime so violent they'd caused schools to close and municipal bus routes to change. It was small wonder that this governmental building was so foreboding. Dozens of police officers had been killed, caught up in the endless drug wars that blighted this land. The guards at the entrance were taking their chances. They were heavily armed, police assault rifles slung across their riot shoulder pads and bulletproof vests lying underneath. Passing through scanners and scrutiny, we emerged on the other side. There we were met by Colonel Luis de Castro, a short man with dark, tightly cut hair, a firm jaw, and a precisely ironed shirt. He looked like someone born to be in the service of the state. Greeting us with an iron handshake, he was quick to address why we had come here: to see Sao Paulo's seized gun repository. "A few years ago we had a gun amnesty," he said as if delivering an order, his voice a staccato drumbeat. "Here we have about 20,000 weapons confiscated or handed in. We offer between $50 and $100 for each one." The colonel spun on a heel and led us at pace down a long corridor, lit by naked and glaring fluorescent strips. The sandpaper walls here were bare and the floor scuffed, and as we descended slowly into the sodium-colored belly of this bureaucratic beast, the colonel walked ahead, his boots sounding the mark of his passage. Then he stopped at a grey door and motioned us inside. Beyond lay a small room with a few computer terminals, in front of which sat uniformed officers. They were inputting data and looked up at us with the eyes of people whose lives were spent in rooms without sunlight. Across from them lay a caged door. The colonel called out and a shadowed face appeared. Keys were turned and the door swung outwards. We walked into the semi-darkness. Beyond lay thousands of guns. Every surface was filled with them, the walls lined with wooden narrow boxes like a mail sorting office, each pigeonhole containing a gun with a small paper label attached. Space here had run out long ago, and the guns spilled out onto the counters and the wooden chairs that spread across the floor. A door led on to another room, and then another, and the scene was the same in each. There were semi-automatics from North America, hunting rifles from China, a 9mm pistol from Germany, an old blunderbuss from England. There were homemade handguns and high-tech machine guns. Black guns so corroded with time you imagined them wielded by slave owners in long shut-down plantations. There were even some with Policia stamped on them, because when Brazilian gangs kill a policeman, the prize is that downed cop's sidearm as well as his life. Then it struck me how, like the cliched 6 degrees of separation, this graveyard of guns was somehow more significant than just what was visible in this narrow space. Each gun here, either through maker or victim, shooter or seller, was somehow linked to a bigger story. each connected to the outside world in a deeper, more nebulous way. Here were revolvers bought with taxpayers' money and ordnance left over from long-forgotten wars. Police pistols and army handguns, sports rifles and hunting shotguns from all over the world, many of them tainted with the stain of murderous deeds. The microcosm of life, of law and protection, violence and vengeance, leisure and provision, was laid out in these shadows. In a sense, this layer of guns was a symbolic image for all of the human rights tragedies I had ever been trying to explain as an investigative journalist and a human rights researcher. And the idea for this book was conceived in that moment. A desire to trace the gun's pathway from its metallic cradle to its blood-tinged grave. A journey to discover the life cycle of the gun and, in so doing, to understand a little bit more about death and maybe even a little about life. There are almost 1 billion guns in the world, more than ever before. An estimated 12 billion bullets are produced every year. Over 100 countries have their own gun industries, and 20 nations recently saw children carrying guns into conflicts. In this new millennium, AK-47 rifles have even been sold for as little as $50. These are hard facts that have harder consequences. And yet, despite how shocking these numbers are to hear, before I began to research the world of the gun, these were facts I did not know. Perhaps this is because the gun remains all too often forgotten in our media and news. Throughout my career, I had frequently reported on the harm wrought by firearms, but I had never actually done a report on the gun itself. It was a bit like the face of evil. You knew it was there, but you felt a little foolish mentioning it. With other weapons it was different. A kitchen knife? He was beheaded? My God, that's terrible. But with a gun it was more like, of course there's a gun. Guns were just there, remarkable but unremarked upon. In Luce Clégy's shaded bedroom, I had seen one face of the gun, the way it can take a life. In Sao Paulo's police headquarters I'd seen another, the way the police seek to contain and control guns. But these were isolated images, scattered pieces. Seeing them on their own did not answer questions such as, who made those guns? How did those police pistols end up being used in a killing? Who profited from the sales of those Uzis? I knew some of the answers. The assignments and campaigns I had worked on had been diverse enough to allow this. War correspondents usually just witness the harm that guns cause. Arms trade campaigners often focus on the world of immoral governments. Investigative journalists seek to expose corrupt gun sellers. I had earned a living carrying out all of these roles, and so had seen glimpses of such things and more. Reporting on trafficked women in eastern India or filming the slums of Buenos Aires, seeing the impact of violence in the borderlands of Mexico, or recording the tense diplomatic standoffs between China and Taiwan, I'd seen the gun in many of its varied colors. But there were gaps. I knew little about the world of hunters. I'd never met a sniper, never been inside a gun factory. What I wanted was to bring these parts together, to see the whole, the gun as a sum of its many parts. Of course, such an undertaking was ambitious. People would suck in their breath when I told them what I wanted to do. Certainly it was global. Too much of the media has fixated on the US's relationship with guns and that alone, but I wanted to take in the wider view. Guns in the US showed, to me, just the tip of a bloody iceberg. This was, then, a journey born from both memory and new experiences. One where I had to revisit worn notebooks as well as tread the carpets of endless airports on my way to yet another killing. And through doing so, I sought to weave a complete tapestry of the impact of guns on our world, where the thread of a moment lived in one city might unexpectedly find itself tied to a visit planned in another, far away. The view I sought was certainly too big to take in without some sort of plan, so I decided to divide my research into the communities the gun impacted. There were those directly harmed by firearms, the dead, the wounded, the suicidal, those who used guns to exert a form of power, murderers and criminals, police and armed forces, the people who used these weapons for pleasure, hobbyists and hunters, and those who sought to profit from their sale, traders, smugglers, lobbyists, and, ultimately, the manufacturers. I planned to approach each community in turn, merging memories and interviews, new trips and research, to grasp fully what it was like to live and die under the gun's shadow. To begin, though, I wanted to understand a little bit more about firearms themselves, to see their historic place in the world, how they evolved, and how they have influenced the unfolding of history. So I arranged to travel northwards from my home in London to the largest museum collection of guns in the world, to the Royal Armouries in the English town of Leeds. The gun collection at the British National Firearms Centre started almost 400 years ago. It was originally dreamed up by King Charles I, a hapless monarch who wanted to give some uniformity to his kingdom's procurement of arms. Since then, the centuries have added to the collection. Today, the armoury boasts the largest number of unique rifles and handguns kept anywhere under one roof. If there was one place to begin a deeper understanding of the world of the gun, this was surely it. So, on a blustery day in spring, the senior curator there, Mark Murray Flutter, agreed to meet me at the entrance of the public museum. A large and effusive man, he greeted me in a flurry of great strides and smiles. He held out his left hand to shake me by my right, and it confused me. I looked down. Instead of flesh, I saw a prosthetic limb. Ex-military, I thought. The price a man pays for being too close to guns. He ignored the look on my face. Without explaining where we were going, Mark turned and led me away from the municipal grey building at a brisk pace, his tie fluttering. We walked down a wind-filled road under heavy, tea-coloured clouds, and there, through an unnamed and unmarked door, we crossed into a windowless space lined with steel and concrete. Beyond was a metal detector, and an armed guard asking through a bulletproof window if he could see my passport. Then there was a body search. Finally, we entered a cavernous space where the public rarely goes. "Here you are," Mark said, a smile widening on his face, "where it all is." Guns. Thousands of them. They filled the cavernous room like squat metal insects, sleeping before an ugly dawn, hunched, silent, and demonic. Under the chrome light you could see row after row of every type of firearm imaginable. There they were, oiled and fierce on the floor, there neat and polished on racks, hung on wall brackets, put away on shelves, slid deep into recessed drawers. It was like Borgia's infamous library, but here were guns, not books. Over 14,000 in steel and wood and brass. And here, unlike the police repository in Brazil, the guns were ordered and neat, their potential anarchy contained. It smelled like history, gun oil and the ghosts of cordite. These weapons spoke of past wars and long-forgotten conflicts, because the curators had tried to get their hands on every type of gun ever produced within reason. When the British used to mass-produce rifles, they would dispatch the prototype, the first edition, to the armories. There they were stamped with a thick layer of copyright sealing wax and stored away. Elsewhere, machines got to work and churned out copies in their millions, and the prototype's offspring wound their way to the foothills of the Himalayas and the steaming jungles of Africa, as this little nation of shopkeepers traded and slaughtered its way into empire. The origins of all of that violent shame and bloodied history could be seen here, and this was just the collection of Britain's guns. There were others too. Here was the United Nations of Firearms. It was almost a case of naming a country and a gun from there could be conjured up. The best way to think about this place is as a library, but instead of having books, you have guns, Mark said, offering me a cup of tea. A reasonable, softly spoken man, he was not into weapons, he explained, at least not for what they were per se. Rather, this wounded scholar liked what they represented. He was a social historian, fascinated by how firearms fitted into society. If he had one interest, it was their ornamentation, their decorative appeal. In this way he saw himself as a benign curator, not a man who would view this room in terms of gun control, how many lives taken, how many liberties defended. Rather, he was interested in their meaning. "I'm fascinated by the use of firearms as a status symbol, as diplomatic gifts, as love tokens," he said, education in his voice. "How they can show people you have arrived. Certainly this is true in the world of those who own shotguns. The higher you go up that economic ladder, the less it's about the cost, the more it's about the ostentatiousness of the design. The Russian oligarchs, the Mexican drug gangs who gold-plate their guns, they are trying to show that they are all-powerful." We spoke about facts. But in a way, when it came to Mark giving a broad introduction to guns, there was not that much to say. In this world, the devil was in the detail. What caliber, what model, these were finer points that many gun enthusiasts fixate on, but not ones that captured my attention. I couldn't get excited about the small tweaks made to a handgun to sell a newer, deadlier version. I was more interested in what these guns did. Just as well, really, because when it came to the basic physics of the firearm, Mark said things hadn't really changed since the 14th century. All a gun needs, he explained, is a barrel, a missile, a means of projection, a form of ignition, and a way to point it. All the developments since these principles were first conceived were pretty much just perfecting this process. They may be lighter, more compact, but they are fundamentally the same, he said, leaning forward over his mug. There have been two major step changes in the development of firearms: the development of the self-contained cartridge in the early 19th century, and the gun that can fire automatically, developed by the British, by Maxim. Perhaps this is what lies beneath the enduring popularity of guns, I thought, the fact that there's an alluring simplicity to how they work. Finishing his tea, Mark rose from the table and told me to follow. He handed over a pair of white gloves, and then, like vicious mime artists, we entered the stacks. There he began to pass me rifle after rifle with a disconcerting casualness. Closest to us was a Gardner gun, a 5-barreled hand-operated machine gun fed from a vertical magazine. As the crank turned, he explained, a bullet was loaded into the breech, the bolt closed, and the gun fired. Invented in 1874, it was part of a major landmark in the development of the gun. There were even men who saw civilization's face in this mechanized operation purely because the Gardner gun worked on the principle of serialization. As such, the machine gun was seen by some as a product of a rational culture. By default, cultures that could not create such a killing weapon were deemed less civilized, and so open to imperial rule. Such men would have been impressed here, because in this fortified chamber the walls were lined with submachine guns. Anti-aircraft guns, first designed to combat the use of observation balloons in the American Civil War, also stood to the far left. To the right, there were Chinese Dishkas, a gun mounted on wheels called, affectionately, Sweetie. These stood beside a low line of recoilless rifles once used as tank busters. And there, on the end, were Russian rifles that fired underwater. Civilization's progress, laid out in deadly metal. These guns all told a story in their own way. They spoke of how rifles and pistols had turned the course of history, how the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo unleashed the First World War, how the killing of Martin Luther King pushed the US closer to equal race rights. They spoke of how the gun has helped bring advances in industrial production methods and advanced modern medicine. And they all spoke of death. There, on the far wall, one rack held a familiar shape: the long curved magazine, the wooden stock, the iron sights. A gun that could fire automatically like a machine gun, or could let loose single shots like a sniper rifle. They could be chucked in a river and dragged in the mud and still not jam. A weapon so popular that tens of millions of them have been made. It was the Kalashnikov, or AK-47, the most famous and the deadliest gun in the world. So practical and lethal has it proved in modern conflict that it is featured on the coats of arms of Zimbabwe, Burkina Faso, and East Timor. There are statues to it in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, and on the dusty plains outside Baghdad in Iraq. It's had a cocktail named after it, and is a drinks brand in its own right, sold in bottles molded in its iconic shape. Some parents have even named their babies Kalash, so deep has been its global allure. Mark extended a white-gloved hand and pulled down one from China. "That's a Type 56, he said, putting the barrel close to his face. "Yes, it's from a northern province. This folding stock was new. It came from State Factory 66, just one of 15 million of its type produced there since the 1950s. He pulled out another, from 1981, he told me, Chinese as well. His finger traced the first 2 digits of the serial number. There are about 90 variants of this type, he said, and pointed at a vicious black derivative, one with a hard metal folding stock, East German. He needn't have said any more. It looked East German. There was nothing funny about it. You could see national traits in many of these guns, however subtle. The Finnish version had a certain chic to it, a tubular stock that evoked northern European woods and candles. The Egyptian one came with a small tree stamped on it, made especially by the Mahdi company there, on old imported Russian machines. The North Korean one looked cheap and sorry for itself, a small communist star on its base, the Red Young Guard, a force made up of 15-year-old Korean students.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?